For those who have known me for any significant period of time, you know that I am not a very quiet person. What? That's crazy, Jacob says in the loudest voice possible. It's hilarious because I remember years ago, one of our neighbors, Ellie Candelaria, she came across the street and she was coming over for a visit for something. And it was hilarious because she walked in, she visited, she talked, and then as she's getting ready to leave, she looks at Heather and I and she says, "Are you guys always this loud?" Yes, we are. One of my favorite memories, and it's not just me, it's my whole extended family as well. Now, I'll give it up for my sister, Denise, who is deaf right now. She obviously can't gauge loudness and softness based on what she's talking. I remember years ago, we were at a Good Friday service at this church, and she was there. And you know what do you do at the end of a Good Friday service? You're supposed to, you hear the strepitus, everyone gets scared, and then you walk out, and it's really quiet, and it's really subdued, and so we start walking out, and my sister who's deaf doesn't know that everyone's really being quiet, and as we're walking out, I forgot what she said, but she probably said something to the tune of, "Oh, wow, that was a great service," at the top of her lungs. It's just fantastic. I know Mark Thomas does this every time we have communion. He is back there, and again, sometimes it's quiet. He's talking while he's taking communion. We're just allowed. We have a hard time in the Manning family of staying quiet. Now, I know there's times and places when being quiet is important. But I also know that there's times when maybe it is important for us to speak up, not just in our volume, but in what we actually say. We're going to see Paul is now moving out of Athens. And as he moves out of Athens, he moves to this area that Heather and I were really wanting to go to when we were in Greece a couple of years ago, but we never did, to a city called Corinth. And in that city, it was kind of a giant mess. Athens was the intellectual place. This is where all of the great thinkers, philosophizers, this is where all the academics would hang out. Corinth was much more akin to a New Orleans or a Las Vegas. It was a party capital. If you were labeled as a Corinthian, you were known for all of your sexual activities. Whenever someone was going to portray a Corinthian in a play, they were always portrayed drunk. It just became synonymous with sinning. And so Paul is now leaving Athens' intellectual place, and he's going into Corinth, and you got to think to yourself, how do I enter into this town? Because here's Paul. He's got a lot of baggage. He's got a lot of sin in his past. But should he be speaking up? Should he be saying anything as he enters into this town? He got some headway in Athens, but now a totally different scenario. It's a much bigger city, it's a lot more people, and he doesn't know exactly what to do. But it's interesting that God gives some very important advice to him of what he should do specifically. And this is where I think what we learn from it is trying to find out from God, when do we speak up and when do we remain silent? This is one of the hardest things to do as a Christian, especially when it comes to sharing faith, when it comes to the pointing out of sin. When do we speak up and when do we remain silent? Paul probably has some major PTSD along with it, that if you remember, for several cities, he's been essentially chased out of town. In some places, he's been beaten, he's been stoned, he's been left for dead. And so now he's coming into another place. It's a lot bigger. There's a lot more sin. And the question is, should I point out the sin or not? Because if I start pointing out people's sin, most often people don't take that well. Anyone here like it when sin is pointed out in your life? Does anyone enjoy that? Is anyone like, hey, you really do cuss a lot? Hey, your life is a total disaster and you're making some really poor choices in your life. Hey, you really shouldn't speak to your mom that way. Hey, no one likes it when our sin is pointed out. So Paul is going to have to make some decisions of how he's going to live. And it's great because God gives some specific instruction of what to do. All right, so here we are in Corinth. And it's also a very interesting thing, one more point. In all of the other places he's been, his ministry has lasted maybe a couple of weeks, right? Corinth, everything changes, which is kind of strange when you think about it, that he's in this place of total hedonism, total debauchery, total sinfulness everywhere he turns. He ends up making this, if I remember my research correctly, this is the second longest place he ends up. Let's see if we find out how long he ends up here in Corinth. So after this, Paul left Athens and went to Corinth. There he met a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, who had recently come from Italy with his wife, Priscilla, because Claudius had ordered all the Jews to leave Rome. So he meets these two people, Priscilla and Aquila, and they become very influential within the church. And it's very interesting because even now when I say their names, I usually end up saying their names the way that they are often presented. Priscilla and Aquila. Did you notice who I put first? I put the female first. This is one of the few places Aquila is actually mentioned first, probably because as Luke is writing this, he's trying to just keep it set and, let's mention the guy first, Aquila, and his wife Priscilla. But almost all the times after this, it's Priscilla and Aquila. Priscilla is one of those people who's very influential, which I think is one of the most crucial things when it comes to doing ministry. Which is why, again, women tend to be the drivers of spirituality, and it is much more effective when the husband and the wife are on the same page and driving that bus together. They've done studies on what that means for their kids, that if the man is leading, it's somewhere about 8% of the times the kids will become Christian. If it's the mom who is the only one doing it, it's more like 25%. But if the husband and the wife are in this team-type ministry, especially when it comes to their kids and raising them and leading them, the numbers jump to like 87%. It's amazing to think about. So this is a reminder, again, with Priscilla and Aquila, they're in this team ministry, and I just encourage all of you to always be in team ministry if you are in a married relationship. And of course, for anyone who is not in a relationship, you're looking for someone who will become a partner with you in the ministry. Super important. But they're in Corinth because Claudius had kicked all the people out of Rome, which is one of those great things where something bad was happening. They all got kicked out, but then it caused the kingdom of God to spread. Very fascinating. So Paul went to see them, and because he was a tent maker as they were, he stayed and worked with them. So Paul is doing what we would call a dual ministry. He would be a worker priest, which again is it's actually something that's making a comeback nowadays, where people serve in the leadership of the church, but they have a full-time job elsewhere, and they gain their money that way. They gain their livelihood, and then they do the ministry. But this Paul ends up with these tent makers, Priscilla and Aquila, and because they had the same knowledge, they had the same background, he would work with them. And then verse 4, every Sabbath he reasoned in the synagogue trying to persuade Jews and Greeks. So he would work as a tent maker, he would come to the synagogue, and he would talk to them and say, hey, we really need to talk about this, and we really need to see if we can do something with you in your life. So while Silas and Timothy came from Macedonia, Paul devoted himself exclusively to preaching, testifying to the Jews that Jesus was the Christ. But when the Jews opposed Paul and became abusive, he shook out his clothes in protest and said to them, your blood be on your own heads. I'm clear of my responsibility. From now on, I will go to the Gentiles. This becomes one of the major shifts in Paul's ministry. Paul had been originally really set on making sure that he's preaching to Jews, going to the synagogues first. And now as he does this and continues to experience heartache and pain and abuse, he now gets to the point where, look, the time and energy that I have to spend, he still does go to Jewish people, as we will see as Acts unfolds, but he starts turning his attention more to those who did not have a background inside religion. And he shakes off his clothes, akin to when Jesus said, when you go somewhere and if they reject you, just kind of kick the dust off your feet and don't let that affect. The idea behind that is not just, hey, I'm ditching you guys, but more especially for the worker, that there are going to be times that you fail. Period. You will not evangelize everyone you come in contact with. I remember years ago, I never did pick up the video game, but I was really tempted to pick it up. But years ago, I remember even talking about this. I think Bob Kessler. Bob, did you pick up this video game? I think you might have. It was a video game that was all about evangelism. And so it was like you were this person and you would go up to people and you would and the idea in the game was you would evangelize people. And you know how you would evangelize someone? All you would have to do is go up to them and stand next to them for a little while, and soon they would turn from, like black, like in the shadows or something like that, to they're evangelized, they have the light of Jesus in their life. And I was like, man, if that's all it takes to evangelize, that'd be fantastic. And in this game, I believe you could never fail. Like every person you ran into, you could actually evangelize. Now, if you could evangelize and have people turn to Jesus because of your testifying to them every single time, you are better than Jesus. Did every person that Jesus come in contact with, did they turn and believe? No, there were tons of people. My goodness. He even failed on one of his inner disciples, right? Judas. And then this guy his heart was so far gone, but God never gave up on people, but Jesus did not get every single person. And so sometimes it's important for us that we shake the dust off. But also, did you hear the words he said? May your blood be on your own hands, on your own heads. Again, very similar to the time when Jesus being crucified and Pilate was pleading with them. They eventually said, look, we want him dead and we'll take the fall. It's our fault this man dies. His blood will be on us and on our children. We have lost a little bit within our culture the idea of personal responsibility. Especially when it comes to sin, I believe that there are times when it is appropriate to talk about and understand the workings of Satan and how he attacks and how he tempts. But I worry that we are just simply not paying attention to the fact that our choices have consequences. That when we choose to live in certain ways, it may not affect us right then and there in the moment, but it could have an effect that cumulatively builds up until everything in your life starts falling apart and you wonder, how did I get into this mess? I think that we fail to understand personal responsibility because we don't have immediate consequences to our actions. I believe that sometimes we don't think about our personal responsibility because we just simply cover everything with God's grace and forgiveness. I was just talking with a pastor friend of mine. We were chit-chatting about this very thing. And he was talking about how he was ministering to someone who was in a relationship with his girlfriend, and he was clearly doing things that were outside the normal boundaries of a healthy Christian relationship. And he would ask him, and he would say, I mean, do you understand that what you're doing is not what God really wants for your life? And the guy would always answer the same way. He would say, no, I've asked for forgiveness. Nope, I've asked for forgiveness. But wait, what are you going to do tonight? Well, I've already asked for forgiveness. I've already asked for forgiveness. I've already asked for forgiveness. And I think that because that becomes something that we think about, we say without even thinking about it, we forget to realize that those things can have earthly consequences. We may not suffer an eternal consequence because of the forgiveness of Jesus Christ, but we may end up suffering with earthly consequences that can absolutely wreck our lives. And I think that we as Christians sometimes shy away from saying things like this because we're worried that it's going to hurt a relationship. Maybe people won't like us as much. I admit, even as a pastor, sometimes it's difficult to preach about sin, especially acceptable sins that society has accepted. But what you're going to see with Paul's ability to call out sin and to not remain silent, he starts having an effect on some of the strangest people. I kind of chuckle as I read through this because I feel bad for the synagogue. The Jewish synagogue that Paul is at, and he's doing this, this poor synagogue is going to lose, in a very short amount of time, their two leaders. That's exactly what happens. Take a look at the next verse. He says, then Paul left the synagogue and went next door to the house of Titius Justus, a worshiper of God. I just love that this dude owns a house that's literally right next door to the synagogue. But check out who shows up. A guy named Crispus, which sounds like a cracker. I don't know. What do you think? Crispus, the synagogue ruler, and his entire household believed in the Lord, and many of the Corinthians who heard him believed and were baptized. He converts the synagogue ruler and his whole household. Sometimes it's important for us to speak up on sin even when we feel uncomfortable. When I was on my vicarage, I was very thankful to my vicarage supervisor, Pastor Kevin Wiesman. He allowed me to preach a lot on my vicarage, and by doing that, I think I got a lot of bad sermons out of my system, because, you have to. You got to get some like, ooh, this is a great idea, and it's my idea, and it's really not driven from the Bible, so you got to get those out. But I remember one Sunday, I decided to preach a sermon that was very much calling out of sin. Now, I'm going to admit that I don't know if I did it very well, because I think sometimes when we call out sin, we do it in such a way that keeps us in a judgmental, superior position over someone else. And also, I think I did this because I was hurt. I was hurt because of the activities that had happened the day before. The day before I was supposed to preach, we were going to do some door-to-door evangelism. Now, door-to-door evangelism is really hard. It's really hard. But sometimes it does work, and I'm amazed when it does. And we were also going to call on people who had visited the church and we were going to go and just say hi and check in on them and see how things were going. And I had seen actually firsthand with that particular style of evangelism that it was actually kind of effective. It actually worked. People were already open to it. But we had a thing, it was on a Saturday, and we hyped it up big. I was the vicar. I was supposed to hype it up. I was a young guy. I was like, everyone's going to listen to me. I'm so charismatic. People will naturally follow. We're going to have at least 50 people show up to this event, and we're going to go out and we're going to win the world for Jesus. It's so great when you're young and you have ideals like that. I just say go for it because you need to. Because then you become old and decrepit like me, and we become very cynical. So we had set this up, and on that day, 2 people from the church showed up with me. I admit I was personally offended by it, and I was affected by it. So the next day I was preaching, and I'd already got my sermon set, but I was like, I've got to weave in some of this material. And I vividly remember the text that I was preaching. The text I was preaching was how beautiful are the feet. Yeah, it's a great passage. How beautiful are the feet of those who bring good tidings and bring joy to the Mount of Zion. It's about how beautiful it is are the feet of those who go and spread God's love. And so I got up there. I feel ashamed, but I'm going to say it because this is my sin. I got up there after the text was read, and I paused, and I looked at him, and I looked at the entire church, and I said, "Your feet stink." And then I proceeded for several minutes to unload on the congregation my hurt and dismay that obviously you are not a Christian because you wouldn't even go and share the love of God with people around. You're not a Christian. Your feet stink. God is upset with you. I unloaded and I unleashed, and I remember I looked at I couldn't see the pastor because he was behind me, which was probably a good thing because I'm sure he was sitting there like, this is not good. But I kept going, and I saw as people kind of got uncomfortable because, man, I was yelling at him. Could you imagine if I did that? Like, just started yelling at you for all of your sin? But what was really interesting was afterwards, the pastor did approach me, and he's like, "Well, Vicar, you were really upset there, weren't you? You gave a lot of law, which is, fear, condemnation, and I gave very little gospel. I probably threw in something like, yes, and Jesus loves you, but the next time we hold an evangelism thing like that, y'all better show up." So I was convicted by that, and I felt bad, and I did receive a couple of emails from some people who were upset and were justifiably saying things like, look, not all of us have Saturdays free. Some of us have to work on Saturdays. I think someone else sent in, I have kids, and I can't, sometimes I'm awake at 3 a.m. I can't, sometimes we just can't do it. But I'll never forget when I got a phone call from someone who said, "Vicar, can I meet with you?" And I'm like, oh, shoot, here we go. Another guy, he's really ticked off. And so I'm like, sure, come on in. And so he came into my office, and he sat there, and he looked at me, and he said, "Thank you for your sermon." And I was like, wow, this is the first, I've heard bad, 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 bad. Like, this is the first one someone's saying something good about that. And I said, really? He goes, no, you know what? I knew I was supposed to go to that. And I'm scared personally to do evangelism because it's hard. And I don't feel confident in my faith. And so I made up every excuse in the book. And I thought, great, now that it's Sunday, they're going to tell me how much I'm loved in Jesus Christ and everything's great. And then you got up there and you brought that up, and I knew immediately that God was convicting me, and I want you to know that I'm going to ask you to hold another event, and I'm going to personally come to it. I'm thankful when God takes when we do it wrong and still brings good fruit from it, not because of anything I did, but only because of the goodness of God. But it did teach me a really important lesson, that there are times when it is important that people know that what they're doing is wrong. There's times when we have to make it clear to them that the path they are on is leading ultimately to destruction, and you will have nothing to do with that. And we do it in a way not to condemn. We do it in a way not to isolate. We do it in a way not to separate. We do it in a way that shows absolute love and care and concern. And that's how I think Paul is doing this. He's like, look, you guys, you are not getting this. You are waiting for someone, but he has already showed up, and his name is Jesus. And I tell you that Jesus is the one who has answered all these questions. Jesus is the one that you have been looking for. Jesus is the one who has brought you redemption and salvation. And he reasoned with them, and he talked with them. And ultimately, he got to a point where he said, I can't do anymore. It's time for you to understand that because you've chosen this, things are not going to go well with you. And thankfully, God turned Crispus. Crispus became a believer. And also, I think what happened was as Paul got him, other people were like, oh, wow, Crispus is, okay, interesting. Maybe we should follow. And Crispus became influential within the church. And it's really interesting because a little bit later, you're gonna find out, verse 17, Crispus, after he becomes a believer, is now no longer the synagogue ruler, right? Like the Jews are going to be like, nope, you out. We're going to get someone else, and we're going to get someone loyal to being a Jew. And so they hire some other guy. I'll tell you his name now. His name is Sosthenes. So Sosthenes now becomes the synagogue ruler. But Crispus and his whole house believed in the Lord, and many were and they were baptized. This is usually the time in the story when too many people start going after Paul, and Paul has to slink out the back. It's almost like Paul's like, all right, I know how this happens. We do this, I do this, I do this. They beat me, they stone me, they hurt me, and then I'm told I should leave. So I don't know if maybe Paul is readying his bag. He's starting to pack. He's getting ready to go. And one night, the Lord spoke to Paul in a vision. Do not be afraid. Keep on speaking. Do not be silent. Paul, I know that this is the part of the story where you feel like you're silenced. You've got to exit. But I'm telling you, this is not the time to do it. I know that there's going to be people that are going to be upset, but you need to still speak up. I am always thankful in Scripture when things like this text shows up, because I am certain that whoever is listening to this, whether you're listening to it live or maybe months from now on a recording, God has a way of bringing people into your life and then giving you the message you need in order to do the right thing. So God needs to tell you today, do not be silent. That now, for whatever reason, in your ministry, in your life, in your context, someone needs to hear about Jesus. Someone maybe needs to hear about their sin, and you need to bring it up. Someone maybe is depressed and lonely and needs to hear that God loves them. Someone in your life right here, right now, needs to hear this. I don't know who it is for you. I'm going to be honest. I don't know who it is for me either. I haven't been shown this yet. I often get this, and then usually God gives me examples throughout the week like, oh, here, this is what you should have been learning through it. But I'm confident that sometime this week, I'm going to have to say something to someone, and it might be hard, like, hey, you sinned. Or it might be with someone who's broken and hurting, and they need to know about Jesus Christ and his love. So I pray that you think about that, because God's going to give then a promise to Paul. Now, this promise can be applied partially to us universally, but it's also, we have to understand it contextually too, because it was specific for Paul. He says, "For I am with you, and no one is going to attack and harm you, because I have many people in this city." Now, again, there's going to be other times that Paul's going to, after this, he's still going to experience. So this is not something like, hey, anytime you speak from here on out for the rest of your life, you're never going to get under attack. That would be fantastic. Paul would be like, yay. But here he says, be bold, because you will not come under attack. But more importantly for us, what do we learn from it? I will always be with you, and there are other people who believe the same as you do. Satan has a really incredible tactic where he somehow convinces us that we are the only people who have our belief system. We come to the wrong conclusion that we are the last remaining faithful person on earth, and everyone else is just doomed to destruction. And we see this pattern happen many times in Scriptures. Probably the most famous time was with a guy named Elijah, who had spoken out. He was not silent. He was bold. He said, hey, I'm going to have a contest with the prophets of Baal, and God, I really hope you show up for this contest. And he does, and he takes out the prophets of Baal, and he's flying high, and everything's going great. And then the leader of the world, this evil, nasty woman named Jezebel, got ticked off and said, Elijah, I'm coming for you, and I'm going to kill you. And Elijah runs, and he gets depressed. And he's complaining to God, and he's sitting in a cave, and he's like, I don't understand why I'm doing this. Like, we just had this incredible success, and I am all alone. There is no one else out there. And God says, I'm going to need that, and maybe you need to take a little nap. It's the power of food and a nap for our souls. It's insane. I revel at that. And then God says, look, there are thousands out there who have not bent their knee to Baal. You feel like you're alone, but you're not. Can you please sear this into your soul? You are not alone. And when you feel alone, that is Satan's tactic to isolate you. But I promise you that there are others out there. I promise you that if you are going to maybe a college that does not believe in any sort of religion, it is completely secular on all the. You may be wandering those halls and thinking, am I the only Christian in this entire campus? I can tell you this much, you're not. They may be hard to find, but they're there. You may be working in an office building. You may be working in a government job, and you look around and you're like, these people are all terrible. You are not alone. God is with you. And when that happens, do not be silent. Do not be afraid. So he gets this incredible thing. He knows that no one's going to attack and harm. And look what ends up happening. Paul stayed for a year and a half. Now, I know in our vernacular, if I was a pastor and I came to a church and stayed for a year and a half, people would be like, well, what's wrong with that? Like, he left really super soon. But, we got Paul, and he sometimes comes in for 2 weeks and then takes off. So a year and a half is a very long period of time for Paul to continue to minister. And in fact, it becomes such a powerful ministry that he ends up writing several letters once he leaves. He writes letters back. We know of at least 4 letters. We have 2 of them. And it's pretty amazing. And again, this was a church, this was a city that you have to be reminded again where everyone was messed up. It was a place where there was so much sexuality, there was so much drunkenness, there was so much partying that you would walk in and say, there cannot be a Christian here. If you go to Las Vegas, you may say, there cannot be any Christians in this joint. There are. I know of many that are just of my Lutheran persuasion, not to mention of other Christian persuasions. They're in New Orleans. They're in Atlantic City. They're everywhere. Do not ever think that you are alone. Sometimes it's good to speak up. Do not be silent. There are times when you need to say something. So it goes on because there's going to be an attack, which is really funny because I thought that he wasn't going to get attacked. No one's going to hurt you, Paul, but you're still going to face some opposition. So, verse 12, when Gallio was proconsul of Achaia, the Jews made a united attack on Paul and brought him into court. This is a very interesting thing. Gallio is actually the brother of Seneca the philosopher, and Seneca actually writes about his brother Gallio, saying he's actually a really good guy. When you're kind to your friend, that's how Gallio is to everyone. So he's like a benevolent leader and ruler. So it's very interesting as they bring him before Gallio and they bring him into court. They say, this man, they charge, is persuading the people to worship God in ways contrary to the law. Back in those days, the Jewish religion was an accepted religion, but what they tried to do was say that Christianity, though having its roots in Jewishness, was an illicit religion. And if you had an illegal religion, then you could persecute, kill, do essentially anything